Before we move into our next item of business, though, I want to take a moment to recognize the life and witness of the Reverend Marlene Whiterabbit Helgemo, who died on July 22nd. She was the first Native American woman ordained in the Lutheran Church. Pastor Helgemo also served on the Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force. She was co-chair. Her voice and insights have been invaluable to the work. As a pastor in the ELCA, she served at All Nations Indian Church and was a beloved pastor, cherished by all who were blessed to have known her. We will remember her now with a moment of silence. Thank you. As we honor Pastor Helgemo in the many ways she was supportive of the wider community and cared for the most vulnerable, we now turn to a presentation of Declaration of the ELCA to American Indian and Alaska Native people that was adopted by the ELCA Church Council at its September meeting last year. You have copies of the declaration at your tables. This Declaration to American Indian and Alaska Native people is presented as part of the implementation and response to the 2016 Churchwide Assembly to repudiate explicitly and clearly the European-derived doctrine of discovery as an example of the improper mixing of the power of the sword and the power of the church, and to acknowledge and repent from this church's complicity in the evils of colonialism in the Americas, which continue to harm tribal governments and individual tribal members. I welcome the members of the Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force for this presentation. In 2016, the Churchwide Assembly passed overwhelmingly a resolution repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery, a doctrine based on a 15th century papal bull that is the foundation for colonialism and racism across the globe. More specifically, it is the basis for the oppression and dehumanization of the Indigenous people, the original people of this land.
In 2019, Presiding Bishop Eaton appointed a Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery task force to help our church implement the promises we made in 2016 to American Indian and Alaska Native people. The task force is made up of Native and non-Native, lay and clergy, educators, and activists. We have committed not only to implement the 2016 promises, but to find new ways to seek justice and to heighten awareness of Indigenous voices and issues in our church and in our society. One of our first tasks was to develop the ELCA's Declaration to American Indian and Alaska Native peoples, describing ways that we as a church have misunderstood Native peoples and contributed to their subjugation. The Declaration begins with confession in 3 parts. First, it is directed towards American Indians and Alaska Natives within the ELCA, then to American Indians and Alaska Natives beyond the ELCA, and finally to non-Indigenous members of the ELCA. The second part is a series of pledges to each of these groups. The ELCA Church Council adopted the declaration on behalf of the entire church in September 2021. ELCA Church Council member Lonnie Taylor and Pastor Manuel Retamosa, Vice President of the American Indian and Alaska Native Association, will share some examples of what our church has been doing to live out the Declaration.
So, Lonnie, would you please come forward? It's your turn.
Meosin kiksepayo. Bismal biska nisikasun. Asnewati segutinia. And Dantekiwa. Good morning. It's a beautiful day. My name's Lonnie Taylor from the Chippewa Cree tribe in Rocky Boy, Montana. My congregation, Our Savior's Lutheran on the Rocky Boys Reservation in Montana, is the host site for Cree Language Immersion Program, a vital program that will help ensure the survival of our native language. Edina Community Lutheran Church in Minnesota has studied the Doctrine of Discovery and our declaration, and now has a group of 10 people working to further educate the congregation, get ready to advocate for Native issues, and consider reparations from the congregation. Former Bishop and President of United Lutheran Seminary, Guy Irwin, is chairing a small group of writers that will develop an Indigenous response to the Small Catechism. The Northeastern Minnesota Synod, led by Colleen Bernoux, is working with Lutheran Social Services on issues of missing and murdered Indigenous people and also foster care. Indigenous leaders from our church have partnered with Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary to develop a seminary curriculum specifically for Indigenous ministries.
Amy Ruman of the Washington, D.C. Advocacy Office is working with ecumenical colleagues and the ELCA Advocacy Network to advocate in Congress for bills including the Truth in Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies United States Act. Continued support of expanded protections for Native American women in the Violence Against Women Act, housing and homelessness on reservations, and so much more. Sue Delgado reports that missing and murdered Indigenous women continues to be big for our Alaskan Native sisters, which we believe needs the support and work of our church. The ELCA now has a land acknowledgement resource on the Indigenous Ministries webpage at www.elca.org/Indigenous. Each week we'll learn of more and more congregations that are practicing the ritual of land acknowledgement as they gather for worship and at the beginning of all their congregational gatherings. We continue to encourage all of our congregations and ministries to practice this important ritual. Before she died, Marlene Whiterabbit Helgemo led the work of reconnecting our church with the National Congress of American Indians, which is made up of Native nations from across the United States. We are honored to have the president of NCAI, Dr. Fawn Sharp, as speaker here today.
These are only some of the things that the Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force has been working on over the last couple of years. But it doesn't stop with this. If this is to mean anything, then the next steps are up to you as well. Look at the declaration. See how you and your congregation can engage in this truth and justice work as well. See what you can learn, what you can share. The possibilities are limitless, and it starts with all of us.
Since this group began meeting, we did some major restructuring of the church. And one of the things we did was to reimagine the staff position associated with some of this work. Vance Blackfox is Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, a new position that will help our church learn how to be in better and right relationships with our Indigenous siblings and to better understand our relationships and work with the 574 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. Vance will close with comments on where we go from here.
Osio Nagad, Galanchi Dawado. Hello everybody, my name is Galanchi. My English name is Vance Blackfox. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and I do have the privilege and honor of serving this church as the first director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations, and I am so grateful for that opportunity. I'm also very grateful to be looking out amongst this crowd, amongst a bit of sea of red, as we acknowledge and recognize murdered and missing Indigenous women, girls, and relatives who we still are missing and still miss. My position at the ELCA has been one that has been so exciting over the last year. I have not only gotten to work with amazing colleagues at the churchwide organization, but I've also had the opportunity to work with this amazing team of folks on the task force. So please give them another round of applause. As we do this work together, me, in my office, the American Indian and Alaska Native Lutheran Association, and the Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery Task Force, and so many other allies and co-journeyers in this work. I think about how important it is for us to also understand that this is a new way of doing work with Indigenous people, with Native nations. In my work in tribal relations, it's not only to build relationships with sovereign nations across this land, across Turtle Island, but it's also to help this church understand how to be in better relationship, right relationship with those sovereign nations. Part of that work in building those relationships is understanding our need as a church, as Christians, to focus our energies and our attention on what it means to be telling the truth and to heal. People often ask me, how did you end up in this position? And let me just tell you, and I've told this joke over and over, I never wanted this job. And I'm really mad that I'm loving it so much. But one of the reasons I'm loving it so much is because when I say that my call to this church has to be, because I can't explain it any other way, has to be that I'm here to help white people heal. That the Creator and my ancestors, including my dear adopted Ho-Chunk mother, Marlene, whom I'm grieving at the moment, would have it no other way. That I give myself to the service of the people of color and the Indigenous peoples of this church, but also to all of you who live in the privilege of being the majority church. It's time to make a change. But that healing work that I'm seeing happen, that's allowing for my job to be a bit easier, because when I say that, I'm already seeing some of you do it. I think about my colleague Amy Ruman and her team in advocacy, who continue to be on the forefront in DC and other places to make sure that Indigenous issues are in front of our church. And then when we have over 2,000 letters written to our leaders of this nation in Congress about Indian boarding schools and the commission that we hope to have happen in this country to make sure healing and truth telling is done, I'm just so grateful. And I see you doing that work. I think about the opportunity to teach about equity. Those of you who know me know that I once upon a time worked for Native Americans in philanthropy. And we always had to have the conversation about what does it mean that in philanthropy, this includes the church, that out of the billions of dollars that are spent from charitable organizations and foundations in our churches, only 0.4% of those billions of dollars go to Native organizations. And we never have the conversation in this church that we're having in philanthropy about the fact that 2% of the population and 2% of those $1 billion is not equity. Because the wealth built in the foundations, charitable organizations, in philanthropy, in these churches, in our churches around this country, was built on resources like timber, ore, uranium, railroad. It was built on native land. And so equity indeed is 100%. Now we know that's not a reality, but indeed in this church, like in philanthropy and other places, equity has to be learned and evaluated in our minds. Some of the things that we are working on in this church is a gift from World Hunger, which we're thankful for, that will support the work that some synods, like Colleen Bernew and others, and Bishop Ogren, have been doing on murdered and missing Indigenous women, which will start this fall. We have begun a Indian boarding school initiative. An organizer by the name of Liz Andrus, whom I'm become great friends with and appreciate her collegial nature and support of this work. But we're starting in 15 synods. Some of you in your synods may have already seen that communication happen, seeking researchers and people who might be passionate about helping us find how our Lutheran church bodies have been involved in the atrocities of Indian boarding schools over time. The time for truth and healing in regard to that devastating period in the history of this country, your history. Time to address it is now, and so we're grateful for the beginning of that initiative. I want to thank you, again, congregations, synods, individuals, whom I've had the chance, again, to hear from, to meet with, to witness in different ways, the ways in which you are stepping up to be advocates and fellow journeyers in justice for Indigenous peoples in this church and in your communities. Once upon a time, we were known, the Lutherans were known as the advocates, as the fellow co-journeyers with Indigenous peoples. In the 60s and 70s, the Lutheran churches came together to support the American Indian movement and Indigenous peoples across this land. If you have not heard this story, you must hear it. We even have a documentary to tell that story. I'll be putting that on the webpage soon. But we must remember that we were the leaders. This church, this faith, this theology, your ancestors were the leaders in doing the right thing for Indigenous people, for being in right and better relationships with Indigenous nations. And so what does that mean for us today? It means the bar has already been set because we're not quite there now. But we have an incredible example of the way in which we should engage in this work with our Indigenous neighbors, our Indigenous siblings, our Indigenous relatives, to ensure that justice finally happens, that we understand our relationship with sovereign nations and individuals who are members or citizens of those sovereign nations. One of the ways that we can do this, of course, is to continue building our relationships with the sovereign nations, the native nations in our places that we come from, but also with Native organizations. One of the Native organizations that we must be in relationship and that we are continuing to grow at the encouragement of Reverend Marlene Whiterabbit Helgemo and many others is our relationship with the National Congress of American Indians, of which I'm a lifetime member. They are doing the work, the representative work, the lobbying, the educating, the advocacy, and so many other things. And at one point in time, we were in a deeper relationship. One of our Lutheran theologians of before, Vine Deloria Jr., was the elected executive director of the NCAI and saved it, turned it around from 19 members to nearly 200. We have a history, we have a heritage of doing the right thing, and we will continue to do that. I truly believe it. And so building relationships with the National Congress of American Indians, with the National Boarding School Healing Coalition, with the National Indian Education Association, and so many more, right relationship will happen. This church can be the leader, at least within our Christian community can be the leader at doing this justice work with and for Indigenous peoples. This, I do believe. Thank you.
Before we have the honor of greeting our next guest, I want to remind you of some important deadlines to remember today. First, there is a 10:15 a.m. deadline this morning for the non-germane resolutions and amendments to the 2023-2025 budget proposal. And the deadline for the first common ballot is 1:45 p.m. In the action on the declaration, the Church Council also called this church to find ways to share this statement more broadly. And in rooms A122 and A123, you are welcome to visit the American Indian Alaska Native Community Learning Space to learn more about Native American history, culture, and stories. We are honored to welcome Fawn Sharp, President of the National Congress of American Indians, to share an address with the Assembly. President Sharp is the current Vice President of Quinault Indian Nation, Taholah, Washington, and serves as the 23rd President of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native tribal government organization in the country. Welcome to President Sharp. Thank you so much.
Good morning, my name is Fawn Sharp. I serve as President of the National Congress of American Indians, and I am so incredibly honored and privileged to share this moment in time and just listening to Vance talk about the open invitation and that long history and legacy of partnership with the church. I could see the fights. I could see the successes. It's still fresh in our memories, in our minds, in the journey that we have. Indigenous peoples of this country and Indigenous peoples around the world are facing so much every single day. And we've long known, and we share this history and legacy, an inherited legacy with each of you in this room, that the fights and the battles and the struggle that we face every single day is humanly impossible. And we all know that for us to reach that perfect day, as my sister and auntie Marlene faced, a day of walking day in, day out on a path of righteousness toward that perfect day, one can only achieve that by completely surrendering mentally, physically, and spiritually to our Almighty Creator and the special gifts that each and every one of us have been given, and that special calling that each and every one of us have been given. And when we meet on that path of righteousness, completely surrendered to live out a perfect life as God intended and as God created for each and every one of us, we can do extraordinary things. And that is the history and the legacy of the relationship between the National Congress of American Indians and the church. Those who knew that justice that was seemingly impossible is truly impossible if we try to do it in our own mind, in our own might. Only when we meet together and collectively, knowing that we can completely surrender to God's perfection can we accomplish and overcome extraordinary barriers. And for that, I am so incredibly honored and grateful to stand here on behalf of 574 sovereign tribal nations from east, west, north, and south, from Alaska to Maine to Florida to California up into my area. We are rich, we are diverse, and we are challenged. But while I talk to tribal leaders and others, not only here in the United States, but around the world, I often say not only do we face multi-generational oppression, poverty, struggle, and challenges, we have multi-generational strength and resiliency. And that's what you are seeing play out right now with this generation of leaders. Our ancestors long foretold of a day of reckoning when this world and this life was not consistent with our values. And at some point, there would be a day of reckoning, a day and a moment of truth, healing, and reconciliation. Those predictions from so long ago were for our generation. And we are that generation, our ancestors, when they reserved so much of what we value that was gifted from our Creator, our lands, our waters, by treaties, by sacred documents with the United States, those treaties. They long knew that a day would come when it would be a generation of leaders that would rise when all hope was gone and all hope was lost and all they had was a prayer for our survival. They foretold of 7 generations later, our generation would rise to meet that challenge. And so I refer to this moment of truth, healing, and reconciliation as a sacred moment. And we have to acknowledge and recognize that while there's so much conflict around the world, so much controversy, so much division, so much hatred, that we have the ability to look to the past with a very clear vision for a brighter future, a more prosperous future, a unified future, and a just future. It takes those of us to look out across this landscape to find those who are like-minded and like-spirited to join us in this struggle. So I am so incredibly honored and humbled to stand before you to acknowledge that past, but standing on that foundation, looking toward a future where we can meet these challenges that are seemingly impossible. And in honor of my auntie, Marlene, when she called and asked me to come here today, without hesitation, I knew that this is where I needed to be. I knew that the invitation from my auntie, and I knew that the invitation from our Almighty Creator. My leadership is one in which I can not only meet with others to face these challenges, but to meet with others in a place where there's that common foundation of strength. We can meet these challenges. And so I wanted to share with you something that's not well known or widely published, but I think it'll give you a sense of the depth of our struggle, the depth of our pain, and really the depth of what we face in this current generation. Now, I want to take you back to 1945. I wasn't born in 1945. Some of you may have been in this room, but just within this lifetime, more than 158 Indigenous nations around the world have suffered crimes of genocide. 158 Indigenous communities since 1954 have suffered crimes of genocide worldwide. More than 12 million of our people have been murdered, and 40 million displaced from our ancestral homelands. Since 1945, 12 million murdered, 400 million displaced in our lifetime. And that continues to this day. There is no open investigation about these murders or displacement. There is nothing you will ever see in the media about that, but it's a reality that we live with day in and day out, and the struggle that we face. And as I said earlier, these challenges are impossible for any one person, they're impossible for any one nation, but only when we meet each other to rise above the conflict that plagues this planet can we answer our Creator's call for justice and service to those who in this very moment are risking their very lives to stand against very powerful and well-funded and organized multinational corporations who want to dispossess us from those sacred places where our Almighty Creator called us to steward and govern these lands and these valuable resources the way He intended. I often tell people, from the Indigenous people's perspective, we have one prayer and one prayer only, and it's simple. Our only prayer is to live on those lands gifted to our ancestors when time began in a way the Creator intended, to speak our languages, to engage in our songs of worship, our songs of prayer, our songs of ceremony, not only for us, but for all things living. An elder once told me the salmon cannot get out of the rivers and advocate for themselves. They need us. So you see, from an Indigenous people's perspective, we value and treasure all things created, all things living. And while we are plagued and confronted with murder and dispossession of our most sacred places, our sacred sites, we give everything we have to raise the alarms, raise the awareness, and fight every single day so that those things that our Creator intended, not just for our people, but for all people, are valued, protected for us and for future generations. So I thank you for this partnership, and I want to leave you with this message. While there is so much conflict, and there is so much division, and there's so much hatred, we as leaders within our families, within our communities, within the church, you don't need a title to be a leader. We need to rise above all of this darkness because it's very real. And we have to resist the temptation to become apathetic. We have to resist the temptation to fall into opposition and division and hatred, and look to our Almighty Creator every single day with humility and completely surrender mentally, physically, and spiritually. That is our calling, and that is a sacred charge and duty. And when we can all do that and meet on that path of perfection, as my auntie did, living every single day until that perfect day when our path is filled with so much light. And I've come to realize that when you do walk in that way, it just gets better. It just gets better and brighter. And no matter how much you give, it comes back in so many ways. And so today is an example of that. Giving out so much to so many people when we come together in a moment like this. And I'm looking forward to the next hour to give thanks and worship for all the goodness that we've been gifted. Because while there is so much darkness, there is so much greater light. So on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians and more than 9 million people in this country, and as a representative at the United Nations and other events, the 100 million Indigenous peoples around the world, our hands are raised to you. We thank you and look forward to many more years of partnership and many more accomplishments and those things that are unimaginable at this point. But we know that God has intended for us to meet these challenges and rely every bit on His wisdom, guidance, grace, and mercy. Siakwil. Thank you.
Thank you, President Sharp, for this great honor. And we are all truly grateful to those in our predecessor bodies who worked to make the Lutheran movement a leader with Native peoples on Turtle Island. And we're also grateful to our dear sister Marlene Whiterabbit Helgemo, who's sort of called us back into action. This is a star quilt, which is traditional, and we're very happy that you might receive this, and maybe on days when you feel that the road is rough, might feel that we're still walking with you.